virtual series that we do every year. Okay, the recording is in progress. Um, and this is the last one. It's on wildlife corridors, which is our theme for the 2024 Eno Festival, which is why we're doing this. And just to let you know what you're in for, I'm going to be talking for I'm going to try to keep it to about 35 or 40 minutes. And then we'll save a lot of time for questions and discussion at the end if folks have thoughts or questions. I'm going to start by talking about the Eno River Association because I'm not sure that everybody's familiar with that and the work that we do. Um, and then I'm going to jump into talking about wildlife corridors, what they are, why they're important. Um, and after that sort of introduction, I wanted to talk about a couple of specific corridors that we have in Durham and Orange counties in North Carolina, the Eno River and New Hope Creek. They're kind of their own wildlife corridors, and I thought it would be cool to do some specific examples. And in that spirit, after that, I'll talk about a few species that are relying really heavily on wildlife corridors around here, and the work that we're doing to protect them. And then I'll wrap up with a discussion of how we can maybe reimagine wildlife corridors and what that might mean for conservation going forward, and how folks can get involved in protecting their own land and getting involved in preserving green space in their community. So with that out of the way, the Eno River Association is a nonprofit land trust. Um, so we were established in the 60s in response to the threat of dams being formed on the Eno River. Um, so it was initially a community led coalition of volunteer people and activists. They were successful in stopping the dams, and the organization has since grown into I think we've got 13 or 14 full-time staff now, something like that. It's grown considerably. Since the 60s, we've protected about 7,500 acres of land. A lot of that gets transferred to the Eno River State Park, which you can see here. We've also got our own natural areas that we own and operate, like the Confluence Natural Area up in Hillsborough, and Panther Branch Natural Area. And there's sort of three or so facets to the work that we do. The first one is conservation. So we buy land and protect it in perpetuity. That's a lot of what we do. That's sort of Kim's bag with the stewardship team. The next part of what we do is stewardship. So we've got, again, the stewardship team and then lots of volunteers and community members that are helping us manage land. So improving habitats, restoring degraded habitats, by doing things like prescribed burns, and then improving accessibility for our public preserves, so building trails and things like that. And then the third sort of thing that we're involved with is a really broad sort of umbrella of things, but I'm going to call it just outreach and advocacy. So that's sort of where I spend most of my time. We do a lot of educational programming in schools and for the general public. Um, and we do like public hike series and things of that nature. We also put on the annual festival for the Eno every July, which is a great opportunity to hear some music and learn a little bit more about the Eno River and sort of get to know the Eno community a little bit. So as a plug, that's July and 4th and 6th of this year at West Point on the Eno. So I'll be there. Should be a good time. Um, and our current mission, since we've developed this sort of size over time, is to protect the natural, cultural, and historic resources of the Eno River Basin in Durham and Orange counties. Um, so with that context for the work that we're doing, we'll jump into wildlife corridors more specifically. So a definition that I'm going to be relying on throughout this lunch and learn is a natural habitat that connects wildlife populations that would otherwise be separated by unsuitable habitat. And that's a broad definition. It's broad by design. And I've included natural here in quotation marks because wildlife corridors aren't necessarily natural. So natural examples of wildlife corridors would be things like rivers, like the Eno River, and mountain ranges and forests. But there's also artificial wildlife corridors. So things like this bridge uh, over a highway or underpasses or even like grassy roadside road margins can be at a micro sort of scale wildlife corridors. Um, and I think it's also important to note at the beginning here that the scale of a wildlife corridor can vary really broadly. So you get a micro sort of scale, like a bridge, um, like this one over here that connects these two patches of habitat. Um, and that's extremely localized as a corridor. But then you get regional wildlife corridors. I sort of think of the Eno River, this is an aerial photo of the Eno River. It's a little hard to see in here. Um, I think of that as a regional wildlife corridor. It sort of provides with its the river itself and then the riparian forested buffer. It's providing a corridor through a lot of pretty developed um, and cultivated land in Durham and Orange counties. And then from there, you can get all the way up to like interstate or even international wildlife corridors. So this on the right is a aerial photo from NASA of the Appalachian Mountains, which effectively form kind of a semi-continuous corridor on a macro scale from Georgia to Maine. And wildlife corridors are really important. Organisms need to be able to move throughout their environment to do lots of things, to find food, to find shelter, to thermoregulate, to reproduce. All sorts of things require movement. Um, and the problem with that is that in this developing world, uh, that's becoming more and more difficult. So I've taken this picture um, this is from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. This graphic here, which shows on the top just aerial photography on a grade of undeveloped to urban habitats. But then on the bottom, it shows you how much habitat and connectivity is remaining, and it's pretty stark to see it like that. It's pretty stark to see how quickly we lose habitat connectivity as things get more and more developed. Um, when we do lose that connectivity, um, without wildlife corridors, we see things like a decrease in abundance and biodiversity. We see lower genetic diversity within populations, and we see less gene flow, less genetic mixing between populations, increased genetic isolation. We also see reduced climate resilience, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. Um, but first, I wanted to note that in Durham and Orange counties, a lot of our habitat is sort of between, if we look at this as panels 1 through 5, a lot of what we have around here is sort of between 2 and 4. We don't have a lot of totally urban developed space relative to the size of the counties, at least, compared to somewhere like Raleigh, which is a much bigger city. But we also don't have that much totally pristine, undeveloped habitat either. We have a little bit, but most of it is sort of in between 2 and 4. We have a lot of roads that sort of introduce artificial edge habitats. And edge habitats are important in nature because a lot of at least naturally occurring edge habitats are important because a lot of organisms rely on a habitat matrix of open and forested habitat. Um, it provides habitat diversity and things like that. But when you have an artificial edge habitat like a road, you can introduce all sorts of problems. So, for one thing, it's a barrier. A road, for example, is a barrier to movement. Um, for another thing, because you're introducing more sunlight, you change the species composition. You get more open habitat specialists than would originally be there, especially if you have a road through a forest. Um, so you can change the composition of the ecosystems. Additionally, if you have that edge habitat that's not supposed to be there, it makes it easier for predator species to see prey. So you can change that dynamic there. And then finally, the edge habitats like roadside grassy areas are often corridors for invasive species to be able to be introduced to an environment. So all that to say, wildlife corridors um, to help connect green space in our fragmented world is really important for ecosystem health. Not to mention all the research that uh, supports the fact that green spaces are critical to human mental and physical well-being. Um, So I wanted to talk a little bit more specifically about climate resilience, because that's something that wildlife corridors are really important for. Um, so scientists are anticipating that the planet is going to, on average, warm by about between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius by 2100. And to give some context for that, the last ice age was about the world was about 5 degrees Celsius colder than it is now. So it's a change on that order of magnitude. It's a really significant change. And as a result of that, local and regional climates are going to change really significantly. And we're going to see shifting distributions of animals um, accordingly, especially those that are mobile, like birds. So there's a great interface called the Survival by Degrees by the Audubon Society. And Audrey can post a link to that in the chat. It's worth exploring, but they do all this mapping um, based on the current range of bird species and then how that will change under different climate warming scenarios. So I've taken the red-headed woodpecker, which is a species we have around here. They're not super common, but they're pretty widespread. They're not super resilient to climate change. This is their current distribution here on the left. If we look at a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming scenario, so if the planet warms 1.5 degrees Celsius, we see that all this bottom, the southern third of their range is lost. It's no longer considered viable habitat. And they gain a little bit, or this blue up here is range gained. So they would gain a little bit on the northern end, but they lose more on the southern end here. And they maintain sort of the central part of their range. The yellow is still there. However, if we do a 3 degree warming scenario, the southern it's hard to see, but it's 94% of the range. 94% of the original range is lost. Um, and 33% of range is gained on the north end, but that's still a net loss of around 60%. So it's pretty sobering to look at these maps, but it's I think a valuable exercise. And it also um, all this to say um, wildlife corridors are critical because they're what's going to facilitate that shift in the distribution. So we're going to see these really large scale shifts in distribution over time. And I'm going to talk about some that we're already seeing a little bit later in the presentation. Um, but having that habitat connectivity is really critical to allow that to take place and allow species to survive, even if their range is really reduced or changed. And another resource that Audrey can link to is the Climate Change Atlas by the U.S. Forest Service, and it's a similar mapping interface. I just thought the maps were a little bit busier and more confusing, so I didn't use them here. But it's another one that it's for trees specifically, how tree species will shift in their distribution. So I think that one is cool to play around with too. It's worth checking out. So this is all kind of sobering, but fortunately, we're lucky that in the Triangle, we've got great environmental organizations doing a lot of work on this. Um, we've got a lot of land trusts, and we have this coalition called the Triangle Connectivity Collaborative, which is a mix of um, local town organizations and counties and NGOs like the Eno and Duke Forest and organizations like that that are working to improve habitat connectivity and reduce fragmentation in the triangle. And I think they're formed in the last 5 or 10 years. Maybe initial conversations began around 2015 and the first report, and Ken can correct me on this, maybe around 2019, 2020. Um, and then it's been revised since then. But in the last few years, this is a relatively new coalition and initially focused on the New Hope Creek, Eno River sort of corridor. So from northern Orange County east to Falls Lake, south to encompass Jordan Lake, but has since sort of expanded its buffer to include Durham and parts of eastern Wake County or Western Wake County in its models. So it's a pretty broad area in the triangle that it's working to protect. Um, and to do this, they've got a few indicator organisms um, that they use box turtles for one habitat type. So for that's sort of general mixed uh, hardwoods and mixed forests, dry wet mixed forests. Um, the second species that they use as an indicator is the four-toed salamander, which is a species of special concern in North Carolina. And that's an indicator for general wet mesic forests. Um, and then the last one is bobcats, which are indicator species for sparsely settled mixed habitats. So all of these species are really great canaries in the coal mine for ecosystem health in these three ecosystem types because they're really sensitive to fragmentation. They really rely heavily on that connectivity. They're all somewhat mobile in their environments, um, and they can tell us a lot about how the work um, how effective the work we're doing is in terms of preserving that connectivity. So with that context, I want to jump into talking about these watersheds a little more specifically. So the Eno River, which is where I spend most of my time, flows for about 40 miles from north of Hillsborough into Falls Lake. It encompasses a lot of Durham and Orange counties, including all of Hillsborough, the northern half of Durham. Um, and it's really important. It provides drinking water for Hillsborough. It provides drinking water for parts of Raleigh and Wake County through Falls Lake. Um, and so maintaining the quality of the river itself, the water quality is really important. And if you look on this map, all this green space is protected land. We've got a lot of protected space along the Eno already, although there is still a long way to go. There's still a lot of the watershed that remains unprotected. But all that green space helps to reduce sedimentation and erosion, which are two of the biggest threats to the river. And there's a few, I wanted to talk about it. There's a lot of animal species that rely on this, but there's a few really mobile species, um, meaning they move a lot in their environment that really rely on this as a wildlife corridor. And I want to talk about those briefly. So the first of those is the spotted salamander. It's a mole salamander. It spends a lot of its time underground, but they're sort of semi-migratory in that they migrate between breeding habitat, so spring vernal pools in the spring, and sort of upland forests in the summer. They migrate between these different seasonal habitats, and a lot of that time, you'll see them crossing roads, especially during the spring, um, during on rainy nights. They get hit really hard by traffic. Road mortality is a really big concern. So wildlife corridors are especially critical in preserving their populations and just amphibian populations more broadly because they're not super fast moving and they're not super visible to drivers. So they take a really big hit from road mortality. And the green space that we do have in Eno River State Park and in New Hope Creek and Duke Forest are really important breeding areas for them. Another species is bald eagles. So they're sort of a conservation success story. They were, I think, listed one of the first species to be listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act, and have since sort of rebounded in numbers. Um, and we've got nesting bald eagles on both Falls Lake and Jordan Lake. And the Eno River, while it doesn't connect Falls Lake and Jordan Lake, it sort of provides something of a corridor and a flyway between the two. It doesn't directly connect them, but it really expands the green space and the riparian habitats that bald eagles can use for things like foraging. Um, and our hope is by doing that, eventually we'll start to see bald eagles actually nesting along the Eno. And we do see them flying over pretty frequently. Another species that I thought was interesting to include here are coyotes. And I didn't know this when I was until I made this talk, but coyotes are actually originally not native to east of the Appalachians. In 1900, they were found almost exclusively west of the Appalachians, and they didn't arrive in North Carolina until the 1980s. And this sort of coincides with wolves being extirpated from North Carolina in the early part, I think in the early part of the 20th century. or at least mostly extirpated. And coyotes were sort of able to move in and fill that ecological niche that the wolves left. And now we see coyotes throughout the state. We see them pretty frequently in Eno River State Park. And it's a testament to how species that can cover a lot of ground can use wildlife corridors to expand into new areas, even areas that they weren't originally native to. And in a related vein, I wanted to talk just briefly about black bears. So black bears is not a resident species at the moment in Eno River State Park or in the Eno River watershed. It probably was historically, but again, their numbers through fragmentation and direct hunting have been reduced significantly. But we are seeing in recent decades that their range is sort of expanding in from the coastal plain and from the mountains into the Piedmont. So it's conceivable that as we continue to preserve land and increase connectivity over time, we might start to see more and more black bears in the watershed until there are resident populations here, which is a cool thought. Um, Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about the New Hope Creek uh, corridor. So New Hope Creek is sort of directly south of the Eno corridor. It's about 33 miles long, flows into Jordan Lake and then into the Cape Fear River Basin. Um, and because it's a more southern watershed than the Eno, it's kind of a cool corridor for some really coastal and southern species to reach the northwestern extent of their range in North Carolina. I'm going to talk about a few of those here. Um, but just want to quickly note that the New Hope Creek watershed encompasses a lot of the southern part of Durham and a lot of Chapel Hill. Um, but it also includes green spaces like a lot of Duke Forest. Um, so one of the species that it's sort of a corridor for are green tree frogs. So green tree frogs are sort of a relatively new arrival to this part of North Carolina. If you look at like historic museum databases, they weren't really collected in Durham and Orange counties before about 20 years ago. And talking to herpetologists, it's sort of a new arrival. They've been sort of coming in from the coastal plain from farther south in North Carolina. And now we do have them in Durham and Orange counties, but it seems like they're using these sort of southern river drainages to work their way up along the rivers themselves and then along the green space surrounding them. So that's kind of a cool recent arrival. Another amphibian is the dwarf water dog. So in the Eno, we have Neuse River water dogs, and we talk about those sometimes. They're really rare in the Eno, but we do have them. A cousin, a kind of a close relative of the Neuse River water dog, same genus, different species, is the dwarf water dog. And these are really primarily a coastal and sandhill species. But they reach the northwestern edge of their range in the New Hope Creek in North Carolina, which is kind of cool because they're not a Piedmont species at all. They like sandy, uh, slow-moving creeks with a lot of leaf pack. They don't really like the rocky Piedmont streams, but nevertheless, um, they sort of make their way into New Hope Creek, which is kind of cool. It's a cool little outpost population for this coastal species. And then the last one is plain belly water snakes or red belly water snakes. Um, these are again a more coastal and southern species, and we're sort of right at the northwestern limit of their range here in Durham and Orange counties, at least in North Carolina. We don't have them in the Eno, but we do have them in the New Hope Creek watershed and Chapel Hill and in southern Durham. Um, so that's another cool species to keep an eye out for when you happen to be hiking in that area. And I believe they also get over to Falls Lake too. So we're kind of right at the edge of their range, but they're using rivers to expand their range westward and northward. And my understanding from herpetologists is that this is sort of an advancing front. They're continuing to expand their range north and westward over time. So I wanted to dive into a few specific species in a little bit more detail as we continue here. The first of these, I'm sure people are familiar with monarch butterflies. Um, and something that I didn't know until I researched this talk is that there are both migratory and non-migratory monarch butterflies. I think there's something like 6 subspecies, and only one or a couple of those are migratory. Um, but the ones that do migrate can travel up to 2,500 miles from breeding habitat and summer habitat to overwintering habitat, which is a huge migration for anybody, but especially for a tiny little invertebrate. So it's really, really significant. And I've included them in here because um, not only do they rely uh, really heavily on wildlife corridors, they rely on types of wildlife corridors that it's kind of easy to have in a backyard. They really like spaces with lots of sunlight, so open spaces. They need milkweed for breeding. So it's pretty easy to support monarch butterfly corridors by, establishing monarch way stations in your backyard, for example. Um, and something that we do at the Eno is prescribe burns at places like our Confluence Natural Area to restore degraded Piedmont prairie. And that'll also benefit monarch butterflies a lot. And it matters because um, there's been a pretty significant decrease in their populations in recent decades. So what I found was that scientists estimate that their population has declined, especially the eastern migratory population has declined by between 20 and 90% in the last several decades. And it's a big range, but it's significant at either end of that distribution. Um, and the IUCN, I think it's the International Union for Conservation of Nature, I think is that acronym, but they publish a red list of species that they recommend for listing as endangered, and the monarch butterfly is on that list, but it has not been federally listed yet. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service released a statement saying that the monarch's listing was, quote, warranted but precluded by other higher priority listing actions. So basically, they think it needs listing, but there's just other things that need it more. So it's a species that warrants some really dedicated management from land trusts like us. Another species like this is actually a group of species, songbirds and migratory birds in general. So I've taken this panel from the Audubon Society again. Um, you can plug in your zip code or your city, and you can find out how many climate vulnerable birds you have in the Eno River watershed. We have about 48 that are at least somewhat vulnerable, and 12 of those are highly vulnerable to climate change, including purple martins on the left, scarlet tanagers in the center, and yellow-throated warblers on the right. Those are a few of the species. Um, and I wanted to take this opportunity to shout out a program that Audrey, our education manager, came up with called Climate Champions. It's sort of a teen uh, youth climate resilience and project-based citizen science initiative where um, teens in the community can get together. They meet about 4 times throughout the academic year and do a project to boost climate resilience. And this year they focused on songbirds. So they built nest boxes and installed them at our Confluence Natural Area. And doing things on that scale, if it happens over enough geographic area, if enough folks are doing it, it can really help improve climate resilience for migratory species like this by boosting habitat. And it can even happen in backyards or in developed areas. It's really valuable. So I wanted to shout out that Climate Champions program. Um, and then I thought I would do the last species on sort of a success story. And also another plug because river otters are the animal of the year at our Eno festival for this year. So another plug for that. But it's also kind of ending on a happy note because river otters are doing really well now. I'll talk about that in a minute. First, just want to note that they're really important in our ecosystem at the Eno and in New Hope Creek as some of our apex predators. So along with coyotes and foxes and birds of prey, otters are right up there, sort of at the top of our local food chains and food webs. So really important in the predator-prey dynamics there. They also have really large home ranges. So they can be anywhere from 3 up to 30 square miles. Often they're between 3 and 15 square miles. But they really rely heavily on these sort of unbroken tracts of pretty healthy river ecosystem and then surrounding forest and riparian buffer zones. So places like New Hope Creek and Duke Forest and Eno River State Park are really valuable habitats for them. And they're doing really well in North Carolina now, but they were hunted really badly in the late 19th century, early 20th century, to the point that they had become basically extinct in Western North Carolina, and they were basically limited to the coastal plain, and populations were really dwindling everywhere. But through a combination of regulation and reintroduction and over the last century, sort of reforesting of a lot of these habitats, um, river otters have rebounded and they're doing really well. They've expanded uh, into back into the Piedmont from the coastal plain. I think they reintroduced something like 49 otters in the mountains, and now and that was enough to seed the populations, and they've rebounded in the mountains too. So that's sort of a success story that I thought it was nice to do the last species on there. Um, well, we're just about to wrap up here the next couple of slides, but I wanted to end with sort of a discussion of how we can reimagine the wildlife corridor. Because when I think of wildlife corridors, and I think when a lot of people do, they think of these really pristine habitats like, the Blue Ridge Mountains or beautiful rivers and habitats that are untouched by humans. And I think that's great. I mean, I think these habitats are really, really important. They're huge biodiversity hotspots. They're really important carbon sinks, and they're beautiful. But I think being creative with how we think about wildlife corridors is going to be really beneficial going forward, especially for climate resilience, because wildlife corridors are all around us and we can build more of them. So an example is underpasses, greening uh, underpasses with native vegetation. This is a photo that I took from the Triangle Land Conservancy's report of the 15501 bridge over New Hope Creek. Um, and even just planting native vegetation and having green space underneath highways or over highways in the case of bridges um, can be a huge resource that connects fragmented bits of habitat. And similarly, having green space in the middle of developed and urban areas is really important. So this is a picture. I don't know if folks have been to the Beaver Marsh, Ellerby Creek watershed, the Ellerby Creek Watershed Association's Beaver Marsh Preserve. It's right in Durham. Um, it's a really important stopover point for migratory birds. It's got a cool ecosystem there. There's, uncommon reptile and amphibian species. There's beavers, water birds. That's a really important part of the broader wildlife corridor, I think, in Durham. And then even just on the small scale of like backyard bird feeders, they can be super important stopover points for migratory birds. Um, and it's going to take a lot of involvement from a lot of folks doing things on a small scale like this. Um, when combined with our big green spaces like the Appalachian Mountains, in order to really boost our climate resilience. So should all of that interest you and you are interested in doing things on your own land for to boost wildlife corridors to help connectivity, there's a few things that you can do. One thing that has gotten sort of popular recently is to do certified wildlife habitat. So this is through the National Wildlife Federation. Um, you can go online and fill out a form verifying that you have certain things on your property. I think it's food, shelter, um, sustainable practice, water. There's maybe one other thing. And you can pay a $20 fee and get this sign verifying that your property is, certified wildlife habitat. But even if you don't care about the sign, if you don't want to pay the fee, that's fine too. The checklist is publicly available, and making sure that you're doing those things, that you're following those sort of components of wildlife habitat in when you're curating your property is really helpful on a small scale. And one of the ways that you can do that is taking care of lawns in sort of an eco-friendly way. A lot of lawns that are really pretty and manicured looking are really not good as wildlife corridors. They're not great wildlife habitat. They don't really help connectivity at all. Things that you can do is cut grass on a higher setting. Don't cut it super low. When you cut it really low, there's all that microhabitat that's in there that's getting reduced. It's much less able to retain moisture. Don't spray with chemicals. If you've got slopes or water bodies, leaving areas that are unmown really helps to reduce erosion, and it provides more habitat too. And then leaving ground cover like moss and rocks around in the lawn can be really pretty, and it also is great for habitat for small organisms. And then also not removing all your leaves and lawn clippings, because those provide nutrients back into the soil and also can provide microhabitats for various species. Another thing that's really important is native planting. This becomes increasingly important because we see there's sort of an influx in exotic plant species that are cultivated in developed areas. So it's becoming ever more important to plant native species and make sure that's what we're using um, in our gardens and on our property, and on the sidewalks and things like that. Native trees are really great habitats. And if you have property and you're interested in conserving it, something that land trusts like the Eno River Association do is conservation easements, which is it's a legal agreement that basically protects your property from development in perpetuity. And there's tax incentives to do this, and it also is that's how we've conserved a lot of our land, is through conservation easements. And Kim would be able to better speak to this than I can, but that's just an option for folks looking to protect their land longer term, which is available through a lot of our land trusts, and it's worth looking into if you have property that you want to protect. And with that, that's about all that I have for folks. I used a lot of images in this presentation, and these are they. But I'm happy to open the floor for questions now if anybody has any.
Yeah, it doesn't look like we have any questions in the chat. But everyone feel free to either come off mute or type in the chat if you have any thoughts or questions. And we'll just kind of hang out for another couple minutes. Thanks, Lisa. I learned a lot too, so I had no idea that coyotes weren't here for, forever.
Yeah, neither did I. That was news to me last week.
Oh yeah, Lisa said, sitting here in the kitchen telling my husband, "Did you know coyotes aren't native to North Carolina?" Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting. There's a cool map that on Google where you can watch it's like a GIF where the range expands. It tells you like what decade, and it shows you where the range is. It's kind of a cool map to look at.
Interesting, because
That sounds pretty wild. Do you know where it comes from, that map?
Sorry, what was the question?
Oh, it sounds like a neat map. Do you know where you found it?
Yeah, I just Googled
coyote.
There's a range map, probably.
yeah, coyote range map over time or something.
Cool.
Yeah, you typed in like coyote original range
Or yeah, something like that. It's for the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences.
Oh, of course. They got
There's
plants
a,
and
Here
stuff.
we go. I found it.
yeah.
So how wide does a corridor have to be for some of these smaller animals like you have at the top of your screen?
Um, as in, are you talking specifically about like the salamanders here?
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
are we talking, a couple yards or 15, 20 yards or see what
that's
I'm
a
saying?
great question. Yeah, and I'll try to answer it, and then Kim and Audrey can jump in if you'd like. I think either is great. I think there's I know of places that are managing salamander habitats by building little tunnels that are less than a yard wide under roads. And if they're funneled as they're migrating, if they're funneled into those tunnels rather than over the road, that's a really important wildlife corridor. But then a corridor could be, the whole Eno River State Park, right? That's sort of a really nice connected area that salamanders are free to move throughout. So there's a pretty big range of habitat, but even a small corridor can be really beneficial. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yep, yep.
So Brenda said in the chat, I'd love to plant natives, but every time I do, the deer and rabbits eat them. The overabundance of deer especially create pressure on the landscape. How to find harmony? What a great question.
That is a great question. That's a perpetual struggle. I don't know if I have a good answer to that. I don't know if Kim or Audrey do. I wish we had Nick here. Nick might know. Um,
I don't know the answer to that either. It certainly happens in my yard as well. We have certainly used Deer Off, which is like a commercially bought product you can spray on your plants. That's not going to really hurt the plants or them, but it just produces a smell that the deer don't like. I don't know its effects on other wildlife though. I don't know if Eli or Audrey know.
yeah, I'm not sure
Or,
about
yeah.
effects. But I know
Yeah.
lots of folks do use that.
I'm lucky that in my like where I live, I don't know, we don't get a ton of deer. I mean, I see them, I don't know, I've never seen a deer in my yard, but I think that is, yeah, part of the yeah, just like big picture thing of like, why it's important to control deer populations and why it's unfortunate that we have um, killed off many of those apex predators that kept deer populations in check, um, and now we just kind of have to do the best that we can. But yeah, Hillary said that she has seen people build little cages with chicken wire or hog fencing and cover specific plants, like if there's one in particular that they're going for. But yeah, it's a lot of work. I think it can be frustrating, I'm sure.
The North Carolina Extension we live out in the county, and so we've got deer coming out both ends. And the North Carolina Extension has a great list of deer-resistant plants. I mean, deer will eat anything if they get hungry enough, but when there's a lot of food around, there are things that they avoid. And so what I've done is I've cross-referenced that to see which are native plants and focused on planting native plants off that list. I put a link to the list in the chat.
I see that. Thank you so much, Lisa. That's really
It's not
cool.
exactly like you do have to see which ones are native and which aren't. They don't claim that they're all native, but they are all appropriate for sort of this southeast area.
Right. That's great.
And
And
I see another question
Mhm.
from Lauren in here on suggestions for more information to pass on to folks about how to make your land better wildlife habitat. Um, that's a great question. I think the National Wildlife Federation has some with that certified habitat. I would encourage folks to read that report from the Triangle Land Connectivity Collaborative. That's got lots of it, but it's a lot of information. I wonder if Kim or Audrey have websites that would be good to check out for this.
The New Hope Audubon sorry, Audrey, if I spoke over you. The New Hope Audubon Society has some great resources, as well as NC State. They have a lot of like plant this, not that, and things like that to build your backyard as a wildlife habitat.
Mhm. Yeah, I was gonna put, I'm sorry, I'm looking for the National Wildlife Federation does have some good resources for like how to certify your habitat or your wildlife habitat. I'll just put this link in here. That might be helpful to folks. Well, awesome. That was great, Eli. I learned a lot.
Yeah, well, if there's no more questions, we can adjourn here. But thanks for coming out, y'all. This was fun.
Yeah, and I'll put this recording on our YouTube channel, which is called I Heart the Eno. Just typing that in the chat. So it will be posted on there if you ever wanted to watch again or send it to anybody. So probably next week I will post that.
I think my husband now wants to watch it since he heard me spouting animal facts all lunchtime. So thank you for sharing that.
Awesome. All right. Stop the recording.